It had all begun on a dark, windswept night. Her uncle, overcome with greed, had demanded money from her. But the small sum Xinggu had was all that remained of her scholarship. When she resisted, her aunt, seething with humiliation and anger, did the unthinkable. She pushed the girl down the stairs. The girl's life ended instantly, yet neither of them showed a shred of remorse. Without hesitation, the couple decided to dispose of the body and took the cash from her bag. Later, Xingji's body was discarded in the wilderness, left to the mercy of nature. But her spirit lingered, tethered by an unyielding worry for her grandmother, the one person she had clung to in life. Transformed into a restless soul, Xinggu yearned to see her grandmother one last time. In her search, she stumbled upon someone she hadn't expected, a boy. Xinggu couldn't understand why he was there, their paths had rarely crossed in life. But there he was, standing over her grave. With trembling hands, he began to dig, dirt smearing his face and arms as he worked. The boy was Zhou Yi, her classmate from high school. As he unearthed her resting place, his voice cracked with anguish, repeating his apologies over and over again. "I'm sorry," he whispered into the air, his words carried away by the breeze. "I was too late." He wiped away the grime and cleaned her up, making her look her best, to be the shining image she wanted to be when he finally said it. His voice still trembled as he confessed, "Xinggu, I like you. I wanted to make you my wife." Tears streamed down Zhou Ye's face, glistening trails of anguish that seemed to cut deeper than words ever could. The truth of Xingji's death had been too much for him to accept, but it wasn't until this moment, as he poured his heart out over her grave, that Xinggu realized the depth of his feelings. All along, Zhou Yi had buried his love deep within his heart, hidden from the world, even from her. In the days that followed, Zhou Yi painstakingly rebuilt her resting place, crafting a new grave that honored her memory. Once he had seen to every detail of her final rites, he whispered a promise into the stillness. With gentle resolve, he said he would care for her grandmother, vowing to her spirit, "Rest now, my sweet Xinggu. I'll take care of everything. Wait for me." Xingji's emotions churned in the afterlife, grief, gratitude, and a bittersweet ache she had never known in life. Zhou Yi kept his word, bringing her grandmother into his home, where he cared for her with unwavering devotion. Under his attentive eye, the older woman's health began to improve, a small solace in the shadow of so much loss. But life's fragile balance faltered once again. 3 years later, during the season when peach blossoms painted the world in soft pink hues, Xingji's grandmother passed away, her heart too burdened by grief to endure. A week later, Zhou Yi stood once more at Xingji's grave. His voice trembled as he spoke into the quiet, the weight of his words heavier than the spring air. "Xinggu," he said softly, 3 years have passed. "I've finally avenged you." The years had been agonizing for him, a daily battle against his own despair. He admitted he had often dreamed of taking vengeance against those who had hurt her and ending it all to join her. But each time, he had reminded himself of what mattered most to Xinggu, her grandmother. He had stayed, endured the pain, and fulfilled that final promise. "I've suffered so much without you," he continued, his voice breaking. "But now, I've done what I needed to do. And now, I can finally come to you." As his words faded into the wind, Zhou Yi pulled a blade from his pocket. The silver glinted in the dappled sunlight as he lifted it, tracing it toward his neck. The world held its breath as he prepared to join the girl he had loved beyond reason, beyond life itself. If there was another life waiting for her, Xinggu thought, she would want to stand in the sunlight without fear, loving the boy she cherished openly and without restraint. It was a fragile wish, one that seemed impossible now. Even if Xinggu had wanted to stop Zhou Yi in this moment, her powerless spirit could only watch as he collapsed in front of her, his lifeless body hitting the earth with a finality that stole her breath. She had never imagined he would go to such lengths for her. And then, something within her broke. Xinggu wept, her sobs shattering the silence of the afterlife. The pain was unbearable, a crushing weight she could not escape. The world around her trembled as if it, too, could no longer endure the sorrow. And just as despair threatened to swallow her whole, the air itself seemed to rupture, splitting the fabric of time and space. When Xinggu opened her eyes, she heard a familiar voice, a voice she had feared she would never hear again. Her grandmother's words wrapped around her like a warm embrace, coaxing her back to a world she thought was lost. Overwhelmed with emotion, Shungu bolted upright and pinched her own cheek hard, disbelief surging through her. But the pain was real. This was no dream. Her grandmother's gentle face, filled with the same warmth she had always known, confirmed it. Shungu, is something wrong? If you don't like it here, I'll take you back to your old school, her grandmother said with a smile, her tone as soft as a lullaby. Don't worry, I'll protect you. The word struck Shungu like a bolt of lightning. She wasn't in the afterlife anymore. She had returned. Somehow, impossibly, she was back in her senior year of high school. A wave of memories washed over her, a bittersweet flood of emotions. In her previous life, Xingji's parents had died one after the other, leaving her with only her grandmother. Their bond had been her sanctuary, though it was tested half a month before her death. Her uncle, a man consumed by his addictions to alcohol and gambling, had repeatedly stormed into their lives, demanding the inheritance Xingji's parents had left behind. The confrontations grew violent. He had even attempted to strike her grandmother in desperation for money. Fearing for her grandmother's safety, Xinggu had made a choice, one she had thought would protect them both. She proposed they move to a place where no one knew them, a quiet town where she could continue her studies. It was there, in that unfamiliar place, that she had first met Zhou Yi. And now, having been granted a second chance at life, Xinggu vowed silently, this time, I'll be the one to bridge the distance between us. With her backpack slung over her shoulder, she found herself walking the same path to the same school, her determination a steady rhythm in her chest. The memories of their first meeting were as vivid as sunlight filtering through leaves. It had been during a PE class, when she and her best friend were chatting, their laughter blending with the sounds of students playing nearby. Zhou Ye's basketball had rolled toward them, and moments later, he had appeared to retrieve it. He had noticed her instantly, his gaze lingering. When he asked her name, she had told him it was Xinggu. But Zhou Yi, ever the playful mischief maker, had grinned and teased her about her name, had pointed out that their names together formed the phrase Yi Yi Xinggu, a poetic way of describing nights filled with music and revelry. It wasn't just his teasing that made her flustered, but also the way his teammates had erupted into raucous laughter at the playful coincidence. She had been so annoyed back then, tugging her best friend away in a huff, determined to escape Zhou Ye's carefree grin and irreverent charm. But now, as her first day in this new version of her life unfolded, those memories seemed lighter, less irritating. She stood at the front of the classroom, facing rows of curious eyes, as the teacher asked her to introduce herself. Without hesitation, she spoke up, "Hi everyone, I'm Xinggu. Xinggu and Yi Xinggu." The words were simple, but the reaction was immediate and thunderous. The laughter spread through the room like wildfire. Someone in the back even managed to quip, well, Yi Xinggu, our new classmate really knows how to make an entrance." She could feel the weight of their stares, the amusement curling in the corners of their smiles, but Xinggu refused to let it faze her. If she didn't feel awkward, then surely the awkwardness would bounce back to them, or so she hoped. One of the boys in the last row quickly snapped a photo of her and posted it on the school forum, where a storm of reactions soon followed. Comments ranged from admiration for her striking features, her dark brows, expressive eyes, and graceful posture, to less favorable speculations about her demeanor. Oblivious to the flurry of online chatter, Xinggu let the teacher guide her to her seat. It was beside a girl named Wu Yu, whose awestruck expression was hard to miss. Wu Yu's wide eyes and bashful smile were unmistakable signs she was utterly enchanted by her new desk mate. After school that day, she had barely stepped out of the building when she found herself cornered by Xiaoli, the school's notorious troublemaker. Memories from her past life surfaced immediately, how Xiaoli had been a thorn in Zhou Ye's side, always challenging him to fights and earning countless reprimands as a result. Worse, there had been a particularly ugly incident when Xiaoli was accused of harassing a female student. That scandal had been swept under the rug thanks to his family's connections and a hefty payout. Xinggu decided then and there that this was the kind of person she should avoid at all costs. But Xiaoli's lackeys had other plans. They blocked her path with smug grins, their jeers carrying a mocking edge. One of them leaned in, his tone dripping with mockery, suggesting that Xinggu was rendered speechless from the sheer excitement of being in Xiaoli's presence. Another chimed in, urging her to join them for some fun and thrilling escapades outside the school. Xinggu, however, had only one thought: escape. As she tried to sidestep them, Xiaoli's hand darted out, aiming to grab her backpack and keep her from leaving. But before he could touch her, a lightweight jacket came sailing through the air, landing on Xingji's head and draping over her bag. The unexpected interruption startled everyone, forcing Xiaoli to look up and freeze. Zhou Yi stood across the corridor, his posture casual, but his gaze cutting like a blade. His voice rang out, cold and commanding, slicing through the tension like a whip. "You're in my way. Crawl or scram, your choice." Seizing the opportunity, Xinggu slipped away, her heart pounding as she left the scene behind. Meanwhile, Xiaoli, thoroughly humiliated, bristled with anger. His frustration turned sharply toward Zhou Yi, igniting yet another spark in their already volatile rivalry. Zhou Yi met Xiaoli's furious glare with an unbothered arch of his brow, the hint of a smirk tugging at his lips. Xiaoli spat out an indignant retort, demanding to know who Zhou Yi thought he was to dare speak to him in such a manner. Zhou Yi, unruffled, delivered his response with cutting precision, his tone sharp and laced with a mocking edge. "Who am I? I'm your father." Feeling utterly humiliated by Zhou Yi's words, Xiaoli lunged, ready to strike, but Zhou Yi didn't back down, meeting the challenge head-on. Xinggu, standing on the sidelines, was paralyzed by indecision. Her instinct told her to run, but her heart anchored her in place, unwilling to look away. Zhou Yi, however, remained unfazed, his voice carrying the same nonchalant confidence as before. Well, young Master Xia. Didn't you get enough of a beating last time? Or do you really think you can cause trouble here again?" Xiaoli, ever prideful and quick to anger, clenched his fists. Violence had always been his weapon of choice, and he wasn't about to back down without proving his point. Yet, before the fight could escalate, an unexpected intervention came in the form of a phone call. The sharp trill of Xiaoli's ringtone seemed to drain the tension from the air. He glanced at the screen, his irritation easing just enough for him to begrudgingly call off his lackeys and leave with them in tow. Xinggu watched him go, a mix of relief and exhilaration swirling in her chest. Her gaze shifted back to Zhou Yi, and in that moment, she couldn't suppress the joy bubbling within her. Her heart raced uncontrollably, as if it recognized something her mind couldn't fully grasp. A wave of emotion swept over her, a profound ache that felt like reunion and longing intertwined. It was as though her heart had crossed mountains and rivers, defied the boundaries of life and death, and finally, found its way back to him. When Zhou Yi approached Xinggu, his expression unreadable, he simply held out a hand and told her to give him the shirt. She had clutched it without realizing and only now tugged it free. But in her flustered state, her foot caught on the fabric, and she stepped on it. One of the boys nearby froze in horror, his voice sharp with panic. "Whoa, classmate! You just stepped on Yiji's shirt." Xingji's face turned red as she looked at Zhou Yi, her expression a mix of guilt and innocence. She quickly apologized, her voice soft as she explained it wasn't intentional. Then, gathering her composure, she thanked him sincerely for helping her earlier. "The shirt's dirty now," she offered hesitantly. "Let me take it home, wash it, and return it to you tomorrow. Would that be okay?" Zhou Yi didn't reply immediately, his gaze distant as though weighing her words. Then, with a small nod, he signaled to his friend, who followed him as he turned to leave. As they passed each other, Xingji's chest tightened with an inexplicable rush of emotion. Waves of happiness rolled through her as if her heart recognized something beyond logic, a reunion of sorts that sent ripples of joy through her soul. To see Zhou Yi again felt like a gift she hadn't dared to hope for. Behind him, Zhou Yi's friend couldn't resist nudging him, confusion mingling with curiosity. "Yi, you're just leaving your shirt behind?" Zhou Yi retorted, "What, are you planning to wash it for me instead?" The boy paused, his tone shifting to mild awe. "Man, I still can't believe it. Yi Xingji's voice doesn't match her looks at all. She's so stunning, but her voice is all soft and sweet. It doesn't suit her nickname at all." Zhou Yi stopped abruptly, his expression darkening. He hadn't known about the cruel nickname the school had given Xingge, Yi Xingge. Zhou Yi could see all too clearly that the post on the school forum had reached a boiling point of controversy. Furious, he fumed silently. The headline alone was enough to mislead anyone into believing Xingge Yi's life was the epitome of reckless indulgence. The comments were even worse, vulgar, unfiltered words that made his grip on his phone tighten. For a moment, it seemed as though he might crush the device in sheer frustration. His friend, however, were oblivious to the storm brewing in his head. He joked with a teasing grin, trying to lighten the mood. "What's got you so worked up, Yi? Don't tell me you've fallen for the new girl at first sight. Is that why you can't stand people trashing her? Or wait, maybe you've got selective vision? You're ignoring the positive comments and focusing only on the bad ones." Zhou Yi shot him a dark look but didn't bother explaining. Instead, he tossed the phone back to his friend with more force than necessary. The moment passed, but then his gaze shifted, catching sight of someone lingering in the shadows. It was Xingge, her figure half hidden as though she hadn't meant to be seen. She froze when their eyes met, a jolt of embarrassment flashing across her face. Her wide-eyed expression betrayed her guilt, but as much as she wanted to look away, something about Zhou Yi's steady gaze rooted her to the spot. Her heart pounded in her chest like a drum. Overwhelmed, she turned quickly and fled, leaving only the soft rustle of her retreat behind her. Zhou Yi stood motionless for a beat, watching her vanish around the corner. Then, as though unaware of himself, a quiet, contented smile crept onto his face, the kind of smile that spoke of something deeper than amusement. His friend, noticing the change in his expression, looked baffled. "Yi, what's up with you? Why were you standing there smiling like that? What are you even thinking about?" But Zhou Yi didn't answer, the echo of Xingge Yi's hurried steps still playing in his mind. Zhou Yi's frustration boiled over, his mind replaying the crude accusations spread like wildfire on the school forum. In his head, a certain image solidified: the culprit behind the chaos wasn't some random stranger. The username that had stirred up the storm felt all too familiar. When his friend casually tossed out the ID in question, Zhou Yi connected the dots almost instantly. It had to be Su Mingzhi, the lackey of Xiaoli from Class 7, notorious for stirring up drama both online and in person. The more Zhou Yi thought about it, the clearer it became. The angle of the photos, the timing, it was too deliberate, too precise to be the work of someone who wasn't in their class. And now, with Xingge Yi's reputation unfairly dragged through the mud, something within him sparked. A protective instinct, sharp and unyielding, drove him to action. "Xingge Yi's her name," he muttered, irritation lacing his tone. Not whatever nonsense they're saying online. He wasn't going to let this slide. His friend, the one with the dyed hair, who always seemed a little too entertained by drama, raised an eyebrow at his reaction. "Wait, hold on," his friend said, half joking, half incredulous. "Why were you getting so worked up over her, huh? I say the name Yi Xingge, and you get all defensive? What's that about?" But Zhou Yi only gave a small, cryptic smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He leaned back slightly, his posture relaxing as if to deflect any further probing. Instead, he redirected the topic effortlessly. "The teacher's been harping on about being friendly to new classmates," he said, his tone light. "Guess I'm just trying to follow their advice for once." His friend nearly choked on laughter. "You? Listening to the teacher? Since when?" But Zhou Yi didn't answer, only letting that enigmatic smile linger as he shifted his focus elsewhere. Moments later, without a word of warning, Zhou Yi launched himself onto the staircase railing and slid down with an effortless grace that made it seem like he was made for these dramatic exits. His friend could only stare, utterly baffled. "What happened to basketball later?" the other boy called after him, voice tinged with exasperation. But Zhou Yi wasn't listening. His mind was already ahead, fixated on catching up to a certain someone. After all, Xingge had stirred something in him, something unspoken, something that wouldn't let him stay still. Zhou Yi found himself on the quieter side of town, a place where affluence seemed to drip from every corner. The clean streets and pristine buildings stood in stark contrast to the unease curling in his chest. Somewhere in the distance, his eyes caught the familiar figure of a girl disappearing through the gates of an upscale residential complex. For a moment, his curiosity held him still, but it didn't stop the wave of introspection that followed. The sight of her in such a place left him with a bitter taste. Zhou Yi had overheard snippets of conversation from a young couple nearby, their awe over the exorbitant housing prices filling the air like static. The woman's tone was adamant, almost indignant, about her preference for the neighborhood, good security, excellent facilities. It was the kind of lifestyle Zhou Yi knew he couldn't fathom, and yet, here she was, fitting into it like she belonged. A memory tugged at him then, one of a colder time, harsher and raw. 8 years ago, in the unforgiving grip of winter, Zhou Yi had been reduced to begging on the streets. He could still remember the way his fingers trembled as he held out his hand, hoping for the kindness of strangers. That day, a woman had spared him a few coins, her voice warm and consoling, but it wasn't her kindness that remained etched in his memory. She hadn't noticed him then, her attention stolen by the brightness of a large screen across the street. Zhou Yi had followed her gaze, seeing the woman's excitement reflected in the pride she took in the broadcast. The screen displayed a children's ballet competition, one she had judged as a panelist. That fleeting moment, insignificant to anyone else, had been the first time Zhou Yi had laid eyes on the girl. It had marked the beginning of an unspoken awareness, a thread that tied him to her in ways he couldn't yet understand. On the large screen, a girl introduced herself with a voice so soft and endearing that it could melt even the coldest of hearts. "My name is Xingge," she'd said, her tone like a melody meant to linger in the air. That moment had left a profound impression on Zhou Yi, as if a ray of warm sunlight had pierced through the chill of his guarded world and settled in his heart. Zhou Yi had never imagined he'd cross paths with Xingge again. Life had a way of separating people like them, she, the embodiment of grace, and he, the infamous troublemaker of his school. Yet here she was, stepping into his world from watching, carrying an aura that demanded admiration. Zhou Yi lingered by the entrance, unsure what he was even waiting for, when he caught a snippet of conversation drifting from within. Xingji's voice was soft, affectionate, as she chatted with her grandmother. She talked about stopping by the store to pick up some of her favorite snacks, while her grandmother planned to buy meat and celery for dumplings. Unbeknownst to her, Zhou Yi had also overheard their conversation. Hidden among the trees, he exhaled deeply, his rigid stance softening for the first time in hours. Xingge was happy, surrounded by love and comfort. That was enough for him, at least for now. The next morning, the school was abuzz with disbelief. Zhou Yi, the boy who prided himself on his tardiness, had shown up at school early, a sight so rare it bordered on myth. Whispers followed him through the halls, but Zhou Yi had no patience for their astonishment. He was there for one reason, retribution. Someone had crossed a line, and Zhou Yi wasn't about to let it slide. A student named Su Mingzhi had made the grievous mistake of snapping photos of Xingge and posting them on the school's forum. The captions were laced with veiled mockery, the kind that fueled gossip and drew the wrong sort of attention to Xingge. The posts hadn't just stirred up idle chatter among students, they'd also caught the interest of the school's resident troublemakers. Zhou Yi found Su Mingzhi easily enough. Without hesitation, he grabbed the boy by the collar, lifting him off the ground with a strength that silenced any protests. In one swift motion, Zhou Yi slammed him against the wall, the impact reverberating through the quiet corridor. "What's your problem?" Su Mingzhi spat, his bravado a weak attempt to mask his fear. "It's barely morning, and you're already looking for a fight." When Su Mingzhi finally recognized his aggressor, his defiance crumbled. "Yi. Brother Yi," he stammered, his tone shifting to one of desperate appeasement. "I didn't mean it. Let's talk this out, okay?" Zhou Yi's expression didn't waver. He had no interest in excuses. "Your phone," he ordered, his voice cold and clipped. "Hand it over." Terrified, Su Mingzhi complied, unlocking his phone and handing it to Zhou Yi. He wouldn't dare defy him, not now, not ever. Everyone at the school knew Zhou Yi's reputation, he was ruthless, uncompromising, and carried an air of danger that warned others to tread carefully. People whispered that once he set his mind on something, there was no turning back, no escape for the unfortunate soul caught in his path. If Su Mingzhi thought he could talk his way out of this, he was sorely mistaken. I didn't mean to take those pictures, Su Mingzhi stammered, his voice trembling as he tried to explain himself. I just thought she looked pretty. That's all. But Zhou Yi wasn't interested in excuses. Before Su Mingzhi could say another word, his fist swung again, delivering a blow that sent him sprawling to the ground. He gasped in pain, struggling even to sit up, when Zhou Yi's icy voice cut through his haze of fear. Tell me, he demanded, his tone sharp and unyielding. How many photos of her are on your phone? Are there backups? Did you send them to anyone else? Su Mingzhi froze, every instinct urging him to tell the truth. Words stumbled out of his mouth in a panicked rush. Just the ones in my gallery. No backups, I swear. I didn't send them to anyone else, but I did post them. I don't know if someone saved them. His admission only seemed to fuel Zhou Yi's fury. His fist tightened, and with another sharp punch, he left Su Mingzhi dazed. His voice, cold as ice, demanded, delete them. Every single one. Now. And take down the post. Terrified of another hit, Su Mingzhi scrambled to comply. I'll delete them. I'm deleting them right now. His fingers trembled as he opened his phone, erasing the photos one by one under Zhou Yi's watchful glare. He hoped, prayed even, that this would satisfy him and he'd be left alone. But Zhou Yi wasn't finished. With a swift motion, he grabbed Su Mingzhi by the collar, pulling him to his feet like a rag doll. His warning was delivered with a venom that left no room for doubt. Don't mess with Xinggu again. If you do, I won't just stop at this. His grip tightened before he shoved Su Mingzhi hard against the wall, the force enough to rattle his bones. Su Mingzhi leaned heavily against the wall, too shaken to even move, and Zhou Yi stalked off without a backward glance. The message had been delivered loud and clear. There would be no next time, not if he valued his safety. Su Mingzhi couldn't understand how it had all spiraled out of control. He had no strength to fight back, no way to defend himself against Zhou Yi. And as the bruises on his skin bloomed, a thought flared in his mind, resentful and defiant, over a girl? Was it really worth all this? The next day, all the chatter about Xinggu abruptly ceased, leaving her friend bewildered at how quickly the topic surrounding her had vanished. Yet, Xinggu appeared entirely unfazed by the sudden shift. She had already decided to return the jacket to Zhou Yi, freshly cleaned and carefully folded, by bringing it to his class in person. But Zhou Yi hadn't been there that day. Instead, her thoughtful gesture had fallen to Chen Hao, his classmate, who was left stunned when Xinggu asked for him by name. How did she even know his name? Chen Hao hadn't introduced himself to her, and yet she'd somehow remembered. At that very moment, he was at a repair shop, hands calloused and dirty from hours of work. Each coin he earned felt like a small step closer to a future where he could stand tall, a future where perhaps he wouldn't have to feel so inferior in her light. When Chen Hao mentioned that Xinggu had come by to return the jacket but hadn't been able to find Zhou Yi, it left Zhou Yi unusually quiet. His thoughts drifted back to the image of Xinggu entering the gated community yesterday, and even further to the first time he saw her, dancing under the spotlight like a fairy, captivating everyone with her brilliance. Xinggu had been dazzling, her radiance commanding every ounce of attention in the room. Zhou Yi glanced down at his hands, still smudged with paint from the shop. The dark stains seemed to emphasize how far removed he was from Xingji's world, a world of purity and elegance. With a resolute exhale, he told Chen Hao, almost harshly, to let Xinggu know he didn't want the jacket back and that she shouldn't look for him anymore. Before he could respond, Zhou Yi ended the call, his chest heavy with an ache he couldn't quite name. Zhou Yi found himself sinking into a gloom he couldn't shake. Chen Hao, caught off guard by the unexpected turn of events, hesitated before relaying the message. He said he doesn't want the jacket anymore. Don't look for him, he repeated awkwardly, unsure how to soften the blow. Xingji's heart stuttered at his words. A wave of panic swept through her. If she let this chance slip by, it might be impossible to get close to Zhou Yi again. But Xinggu quickly composed herself, her tone steady as she replied, "Thank you. Please let him know I'll come by tomorrow to return it." Chen Hao blinked, baffled by the sudden shift in her demeanor. Meanwhile, as Xinggu wandered down the school corridor afterward, she couldn't make sense of it. Her mind raced with questions. They had agreed on this yesterday, she'd promised to return the jacket. What had changed? Did Zhou get into another fight and decide to avoid her out of shame? Or was it something else entirely? Could it be that Zhou hadn't started to care for her yet? The uncertainty gnawed at her, but she resolved to keep her word. Tomorrow, she would try again. Xing Ji's mind flickered with a memory from another lifetime, one that felt like a secret whispered through the cracks of time. Zhou had once said, though not to her directly, that he hadn't yet shed the stains clinging to his soul and didn't feel worthy of standing, pure and radiant, before someone like Xinggu. Zhou had confessed a wish for another life, one where he could stand clean under the sunlight, loving the girl he cherished without hesitation. The realization hit Xinggu like a sudden burst of clarity. Could it be that Zhou had buried his feelings deep, believing himself unworthy of love? A tender ache swelled in Xing Ji's chest at the thought. Whatever the reasons Zhou carried in his heart, Xinggu decided firmly that in this lifetime, she would take the first step. She'd be the one to close the distance. But then, with a groan of frustration, Xinggu remembered she'd forgotten to ask Chen Hao for Zhou's phone number. It didn't matter, though. There was still time, and Xinggu was determined to make the most of it. That evening, after her study session ended, Xinggu took the bus home alone. A strange feeling nagged at her, a sense that Zhou was nearby, watching her. She glanced over her shoulder, but the street was empty. Brushing off the unease, she boarded the bus and settled into her seat. Unbeknownst to her, Zhou lingered in the shadows, watching as Xinggu climbed aboard. Only when the bus doors closed and it rumbled forward did Zhou allow himself a moment of relief. He followed quietly, slipping onto the bus and taking a seat just behind Xinggu. Zhou had only one purpose tonight, to make sure Xinggu got home safely. The cruel gossip that had once tarnished Xing Ji's name might have been erased from the school forums, but Zhou couldn't shake the weight of the words that had been left behind before the post was taken down, words that had been careless and cutting. He wouldn't let his guard down, not when Xing Ji's safety might still be at risk. Oblivious to Zhou's silent presence, Xinggu gazed out the window, her thoughts clouded with disappointment. The entire day had passed without so much as a glimpse of Zhou. What was he doing now? Why was he hiding? Xinggu sighed, the faintest trace of loneliness in her eyes. Behind her, Zhou sat still, his expression unreadable as the bus rattled down the dimly lit street. If keeping watch from the shadows was the only way to protect Xinggu, then so be it. Zhou would follow, as quiet and steadfast as the night. Zhou didn't let his guard down until Xinggu had safely entered her apartment complex. Only then did he finally pull off his cap, breathing a quiet sigh of relief. But his reprieve was short-lived. A group of Xiaoli, still angry about the last incident, had spotted him walking alone. In the cover of night, he must have seemed like an easy target. One of them muttered to the others, his tone filled with anticipation. If they didn't strike now, when would they get a better chance? The way they advanced told Zhou everything he needed to know, there'd be no talking his way out of this. If he didn't fight back, they wouldn't let him leave unscathed. But what he didn't want was to cause a commotion near Xing Ji's building. So, he made a split-second decision, spinning on his heel and breaking into a sprint. His footsteps echoed in the quiet night as the boys shouted after him, their taunts ringing loud. "Running away, huh? Coward," one of them sneered, their voices laced with mockery as they gave chase. At that exact moment, Xinggu, still standing near her door, caught a faint commotion outside. She turned her head just in time to catch a glimpse of a boy with dyed blue hair and a single earring darting away under the street lights. Her heart dropped as recognition hit her, it was Zhou. And behind him, a pack of troublemakers was closing in. Panic gripped Xing Ji's chest like a vice. Zhou was being chased, and he was alone. Xinggu forced herself to take a deep breath, pushing back the fear threatening to cloud her thoughts. He needed help, and fast. That's when it came to her, her seatmate, Wu Yu, was friends with some of the guys who hung around Zhou. Maybe, just maybe, one of them could help track him down. Without wasting a second, Xinggu called Wu Yu, her voice urgent as she explained the situation. Wu Yu, startled but understanding the seriousness of the matter, quickly connected her with Chen Hao. It was late, and Chen Hao had just finished washing up, ready to crash for the night. But Xing Ji's tone left no room for hesitation. "I'm sorry to bother you so late," Xingge began, her words crisp and steady despite the storm of worry churning inside her. "Can you reach Zhou Yi right now? It's important." Xingge explained to Chen Hao how she had spotted Zhou Yi being pursued by a group led by Xiaoli. She described how she had followed them, but by the time she reached the intersection of Huacheng Road and Yan'an Road, they had vanished. Chen Hao's face hardened as he listened. Without a word, he ended the call and quickly gathered his closest friends, knowing time wasn't on their side. Meanwhile, Zhou Yi had been running, his breathing shallow and his pulse thundering in his ears. Every step felt heavier, but something in him snapped, making him come to an abrupt stop. The group chasing him stumbled, caught off guard by his sudden decision to halt in such a secluded alley. Xiaoli grinned, assuming he had finally reached his limit. "Well, aren't you clever?" he sneered, stepping closer. "Or maybe just plain stupid, running into a dead end like this." But Zhou Yi didn't dignify his taunts with a response. Instead, he pivoted with a fluid, practiced motion and landed a swift kick that swept Xiaoli off his feet. He hit the ground hard, his fall graceless and humiliating. Before he could recover, Zhou Yi grabbed him by his collar and delivered a punch to his face that echoed in the narrow alley. It wasn't just the impact that struck him, it was the weight of every vile word he had ever spoken about Xingge, crashing down on him like judgment. Xiaoli barely had time to process what had happened before Zhou Yi struck again, this time targeting the other side of his face. His fury was a tempest, raw and unrestrained. The boys who had followed Xiaoli watched in stunned silence, frozen by fear. None of them dared step in. Zhou Ye's presence screamed danger, and getting involved felt like signing their own death warrants. Finally, Zhou Ye's icy voice cut through the tension, sharp and unforgiving. "Had enough yet, Xiaoli?" he demanded, his tone as unyielding as his grip on his collar. "How many times do I have to teach you this lesson? Next time, I won't hold back." Though Xiaoli was thoroughly beaten, his pride refused to yield. Spitting blood, he muttered through gritted teeth, "If you've got the guts, finish it. Kill me if you think you're so tough." Zhou Ye's expression didn't waver, but his grip tightened, a silent promise that his mercy had its limits. The glaring headlights of a luxury car spilled into the alley, casting long, sharp shadows over the scene. Zhou Yi froze mid-motion, his clenched fist hovering as if deciding its next move. From the car, a voice emerged, calm but firm, warning that cops were on their way. The weight of the warning was enough to jolt Xiaoli and his cronies into action. They scrambled to their feet, dragging Xiaoli with them, his bruised face a silent testament to the encounter. As the group disappeared into the night, Zhou Yi stood in the path of the car's piercing beams, his silhouette sharp and defiant. For a fleeting moment, he seemed to study the figure in the car's shadowed interior, recognition flickering in his eyes. But just as quickly, he turned away, dismissing the moment, and strode off into the dark as though nothing had transpired. Inside the car, the driver glanced over his shoulder toward his boss, a composed man addressed as Mr. G. "Boss, do you think young Master Yi recognized who it was?" he asked. Ji Yingxiao's voice was measured, almost disinterested. "He might have," he mused, before shifting topics. "The one on the ground looked like someone from the Xia family. As for the others, I didn't recognize them." With a small, deliberate nod, he added, "Tomorrow, look into it. If it's the Xia family, pay them a visit. Remind them that while business is business, they're still responsible for their kids. And if they can't find the time, I'm more than willing to handle it for them." The driver smirked, a hint of approval in his expression. It seemed Zhou Yi wasn't entirely without allies, after all. Meanwhile, Chen Hao had raced to the scene with his closest friend, Shen Xing, his urgency fueled by Xing Ji's earlier call. But when they arrived, the scene they stumbled upon wasn't one of chaos or peril. Instead, Zhou Yi sat alone on the curb, exuding an air of nonchalance, a cigarette balanced casually between his fingers. The quiet calm of the moment left Chen Hao completely dumbfounded. Shen Xing couldn't hold back his surprise. Shungu called us, said you were cornered by a gang, he said, his voice tinged with both relief and incredulity. You scared us half to death, and here you are, just sitting here like nothing happened. For the first time that night, Zhouye's confidence faltered. He hadn't anticipated that Shungu, of all people, would see him like this. A flicker of unease crossed his face, but he quickly masked it, exhaling a slow, deliberate stream of smoke into the night air. As Chenhao launched into an elaborate explanation, he recalled how Shungu, panicked and nearly breathless, had called him. Her voice was laced with urgency as she described seeing Zhouye being chased by a group of people. Zhouye noticed the way Chenhao emphasized Xingji's concern, mentioning how the girl had acted without hesitation, rushing to warn them. Chenhao was prepared to continue his teasing commentary when his phone buzzed again. Xinggu was calling. Zhouye waved a hand, motioning for Chenhao to answer it. Just tell her she was mistaken, Zhouye murmured. Say I was home sleeping. As Chenhao answered, Xingji's voice immediately filled the line, anxious and insistent. She wanted to know if he had found Zhouye and if Zhouye was safe. Without missing a beat, Chenhao replied, his tone so nonchalant it bordered on playful. What are you talking about? My buddy Zhouye has been home sleeping this whole time. You must have imagined it. You even had me out here running around Yan'an Road and Huacheng Road for nothing. There was a momentary pause, likely disbelief on Xingji's part, before she pressed him further. Then prove it. Send me a photo of him. Chenhao's response was swift, and his grin practically audible. Sure thing. Just so you know, though, Zhouye likes to sleep in the nude. Want me to send that picture over? The abruptness of his answer earned a loud, startled laugh from Xinxing, who was now doubled over, clearly enjoying the scene unfolding before him. On the other end of the line, Xinggu squeaked in embarrassment, her voice suddenly flustered as she begged him to stop. No. That's not necessary. Just tell me he's fine. Chenhao wasn't quite done having his fun. With a smug chuckle, he added, You're really missing out, though. He's got abs, 8 of them. By this point, Xinggu was so mortified she could barely respond, her words stumbling over themselves before she finally gave up, conceding defeat. Xinxing, still laughing, clapped Chenhao on the back. Zhouye, for his part, remained unimpressed, though the corners of his mouth quirked up ever so slightly, betraying a trace of amusement. Zhouye, noticing the growing absurdity of the situation, immediately instructed Chenhao to stop teasing Xinggu. Reluctantly, Chenhao straightened up, adopting an air of mock innocence. He remarked, almost sweetly, By the way, it's so late, and you're still awake? Don't tell me you've been waiting for news about him this whole time. Xinggu, slightly flustered, admitted, I couldn't sleep, worrying he might be in trouble. I'm really sorry for the misunderstanding and for disturbing you at this hour. Just as the call was about to end, Xinggu hesitated before blurting out, Could you give me Zhouye's number? Her words, though casually framed, carried a hesitant tone that Zhouye couldn't ignore. To Zhouye's ears, there was something strangely tender about it, a hint of complaint wrapped in vulnerability. Was Xinggu truly so upset about not being able to see him? Did missing him cause such distress? Chenhao, always quick to capitalize on a moment, offered a solution with a sly grin. How about I tell him to go to school tomorrow? The idea immediately sparked a noticeable excitement in Xingji's voice. She thanked Chenhao profusely, her words bubbling over with gratitude, and even promised to bring Zhouye breakfast the next morning as a gesture of sincerity before hanging up. Zhouye was left somewhat stunned. Was it really that easy to make Xinggu happy? Just the mere suggestion of him showing up at school had sparked such a reaction. Amused, Xinxing couldn't resist poking fun. Why's this girl so thrilled about you coming to school? You don't think it's obvious? His teasing smile widened. She's into you, Zhouye. Chenhao, enjoying the banter, turned to Zhouye with a grin. So, are you going to school tomorrow? Without missing a beat, Zhouye replied coolly, no, before turning on his heel and walking away, leaving the others to stare after him, bewildered and slightly amused by his nonchalance. The two boys were utterly taken aback. Zhouye's thoughts, as always, remained an enigma. Yet, as the scene shifted, under the soft glow of the night, the shy curve of Zhou Ye's smile betrayed a flicker of something deeper, an almost boyish bashfulness. It was as if Xing Ji's boldness had chipped away at his insecurities, leaving him slightly less guarded. Contrary to his aloof refusal the night before, Zhou Ye appeared at the school early the next morning. So early, in fact, that he'd dragged Chen Hao out of bed at the crack of dawn. At 5:30 a.m., he had insisted they head to school together, ignoring his grumbling protests. Chen Hao, bleary-eyed and thoroughly exasperated, couldn't help but complain. If he wanted to come so badly, why drag him along? And at this ungodly hour? Zhou Ye, with his usual calm facade, casually deflected, claiming he'd remembered a basketball game scheduled for the evening. Chen Hao gave him a look of pure disbelief. Sure, there might be a game, but why on earth would that require him to be awake before sunrise? Besides, hadn't Zhou Ye ignored every invitation to play in the past year? What was so different about today? Meanwhile, Xinggu, nervous about her carefully prepared breakfast growing cold, left home slightly later than usual. She reasoned that by now, Zhou Ye and Chen Hao must already be at school. Little did she know, her presence, and that breakfast, was the unspoken reason for Zhou Ye's sudden enthusiasm for punctuality. When Xinggu spotted Zhou Ye in the classroom, it felt as though her entire world lit up. He'd come. Zhou Ye had actually shown up. True to form, Zhou Ye was leaning lazily against her desk, feigning an air of nonchalance. Yet, the way his fingers subtly tensed, betrayed his anticipation. He had been waiting for this, hadn't he? Still, instead of acknowledging Xinggu immediately, Zhou Ye chose to keep up his act, closing his eyes as if uninterested. Only when Xinggu called his name did Zhou Ye slowly straighten, his movements deliberate, almost languid. Xinggu, always one to notice the finer details, took in Zhou Ye's tall frame, the quiet strength in his posture, and the soft kindness in his gaze that belied his sharp exterior. For a fleeting moment, Xinggu felt relief wash over her. Zhou Ye was fine. Last night's panic had been nothing but a misunderstanding, one she was glad to leave behind. Without hesitation, Xinggu retrieved the breakfast she'd meticulously prepared. She handed it to Zhou Ye, her voice tinged with sincerity as she expressed her gratitude. It wasn't just for Zhou Ye, but for Chen Hao too, for the way they'd helped her out of a tricky situation the other day. Oh, and this is for you, Xinggu added, holding up a pink tote bag. Her cheeks flushed as she returned Zhou Ye's clothes, neatly folded and fresh. There was something in the way she averted her eyes, the shy tilt of her head, that made Zhou Ye's heart race unexpectedly. And in that fleeting moment, Zhou Ye's gaze softened, his feelings for Xinggu written plainly in his expression. The moment didn't go unnoticed by their classmates. Someone called out teasingly, suggesting that Zhou Ye had clearly won Xinggu over, given the personal breakfast delivery. The taunt earned a sharp response, a book lobbed in their direction by Zhou Ye, who muttered something about keeping their mouth clean. Then, brushing off the commotion, he turned back to Xinggu, urging her to return to her own class. Yet Xinggu lingered, a faint blush still coloring her cheeks. Before leaving, she mustered up the courage to ask, almost hesitantly, Zhou Ye, can I have your phone number? Xing Ji's straightforward and bold confession left Zhou Ye momentarily stunned, the weight of her words settling between them. Zhou Ye swallowed hard, unable to meet Xing Ji's gaze directly. Instead of giving his number outright, Zhou Ye turned his head, a shy blush creeping across his cheeks. He murmured something about asking Chen Hao for Xing Ji's number later and messaging her instead, an indirect but deliberate gesture that made it clear Zhou Ye wanted to be the one initiating contact. Satisfied with the answer, Xinggu was about to leave when the teacher called her back. With a gentle but firm push toward the door, the teacher reminded her of her responsibilities. She wasn't like the others, the teacher said. As a transfer student, Xinggu needed to focus on her studies, especially with the principal's explicit instructions to keep an eye on her progress. The words carried a pointed warning about spending too much time with Zhou Ye, who was labeled, almost carelessly, as a troubled student. Hanging out with someone like that, the teacher cautioned, could jeopardize Xing Ji's grades, her future, and everything she had worked so hard for. Zhou Ye sat in silence, clutching the breakfast Xinggu had lovingly prepared. He felt a familiar pang in his chest as the teacher's words echoed in his mind. The tentative warmth he had just begun to feel flickered and dimmed. Of course, they weren't the same. He and Xingge came from different worlds. Doubt crept in, casting a shadow over his earlier joy. But even as his insecurities gnawed at him, a small, defiant part of him wondered, could he change? Could he strive to be someone worthy of Xingge, someone who could stand by his side without hesitation? Meanwhile, the tempting aroma of breakfast roused Chen Hao from his half-asleep state. His mouth practically watered as he guessed who the food had come from. This must be from Xingge, right? He mused, already reaching for it. But Zhou Yi swiftly slid the food away, his tone sharp and possessive as he declared it was his, and Chen Hao couldn't touch it. Chen Hao protested, pointing out that there were 2 portions, and Xingge had explicitly said one was for him. But Zhou Yi only clutched the boxes tighter, which made Chen Hao huff in frustration, his eyes nearly rolling back in mock outrage. He grumbled, "You know I was dragged out of bed at 5:30 for this. My stomach's been growling a symphony all morning." The next second, a stale piece of bread landed with a thud on the desk. Chen Hao stared at it, his frustration bubbling to the surface until it practically brought tears to his eyes. He muttered under his breath how unfair Zhou Yi was, declaring he truly had no heart. But when he met Zhou Yi's fiery gaze, his defiance crumbled. With a pitiful shrug, he resigned himself to the situation, murmuring that stale bread was better than nothing. As he bit into the tough crust, Zhou Yi abruptly stood up. His sudden movement caught Chen Hao's attention, and he couldn't help but ask where he was headed, adding that Zhou Yi should at least be back for the evening basketball game. The realization dawned on him then, Zhou Yi had come this early just to grab breakfast. His exasperation bubbled over as he exclaimed how unfair it was, especially after he dragged himself out of bed at dawn. Zhou Yi, however, was already gone, riding his motorcycle through the streets with a weight pressing down on him. In his mind, the homeroom teacher's words echoed relentlessly, how someone like him would only hold Xingge back, how they were worlds apart, and how his presence could ruin Xingji's future. He let out a bitter laugh, telling himself that perhaps he was only meant to look up at Xingge from afar. Meanwhile, Xingge had been waiting all morning for Zhou Yi, pacing impatiently until she couldn't stand it any longer. Determined to find him, she went to the classroom and asked Chen Hao where Zhou Yi was, only to learn he had left hours ago. A pang of disappointment settled in her chest as she realized all her anticipation had been for nothing. As the pieces started falling into place, Xingji's mind wandered back to the scene that morning. Could it be that Zhou Yi had overheard the teacher's harsh words? Had that been enough to push him away? The idea gnawed at her, leaving her with a growing sense of regret. Xingge mulled over in her head, a quiet determination building within her. If Zhou Yi was sensitive, then she'd simply take the initiative more often. Her silent plea was simple, "Please, stop running away." That evening, the school gym buzzed with excitement as the basketball game kicked off. In the crowded bleachers, someone nudged their friend and whispered about how tonight's match had drawn all the school's heartthrobs. But the real surprise? Zhou Yi was there. His appearance at the basketball game was nothing short of shocking. He hadn't attended a single game all semester, and yet, here he was. The unexpectedness of it sent ripples through the crowd, as if his presence alone was enough to stir the air. As the game began, Xingge couldn't help but nudge her deskmate and ask if Zhou Yi had always loved basketball. The question wasn't entirely random. Zhou Yi carried an air of mystery about him, rarely seen around school, let alone on a basketball court. And there, among the swarm of students, Zhou Yi's presence stood out, not just for his striking looks but for the quiet intensity that clung to him like a second skin. To some, it seemed out of place, like he didn't quite belong to this world of teenage dramas and high school rivalries. Others were quick to offer their opinions, though. Zhou Yi, they said, was all wrong, too temperamental, too violent. Sure, he was attractive, but that was where his appeal stopped. "Look, admire his face if you want," Xingji's deskmate whispered. "But stay away from him." The warning came wrapped in the kind of authority only gossip could provide. Xingge, however, wasn't one to back down. She defended Zhou Yi without hesitation, her tone as sharp as it was certain. "Zhou Yi's great," she said, brushing off the caution like a pesky fly. There was no doubt in her voice, no room for argument. Xing Ji's conviction cut through the noise, even as the game took an unexpected turn. On the court, Zhou Yi had been about to pass the ball to his close friend Shen Hao when it was snatched away midair. The culprit? None other than Chu Yi, the school's golden boy. His interception caused an uproar, girls squealing in unison at his effortless move. Xing Ji's deskmate jumped at the opportunity, nudging her again. See number 3? The guy in the white jersey? That's Chu Yi, the school heartthrob. Zhou Yi didn't need to hear the introduction. He could feel the shift in energy, the way Xing Ji's gaze seemed drawn to the court's star player. A faint pang of disappointment settled in his chest, as if the warmth of Xing Ji's earlier words had suddenly cooled. But he truly had no idea what Xinggu was thinking. Chu Yi might have been the school's idol, but in Xing Ji's eyes, he didn't hold a candle to Zhou Yi. There was a quiet certainty in the way she looked at him, a belief that cut through the noise of reputations and rumors. Xing Ji's gaze seemed to say it all. Chu Yi might have been charming, but Zhou Yi? Zhou Yi was extraordinary. After Xing Ji's bold statement, her deskmate hesitated for a moment, then conceded that Zhou Yi might indeed have the more handsome face. However, she firmly believed that only Chu Yi was deserving of the title, school heartthrob. Chu Yi, after all, was the total package, good family background, good looks, and excellent grades. To her, a school idol had to embody youthful energy and a positive image, and Chu Yi fit the bill perfectly. In an instant, the energy on the basketball court shifted. Every girl's gaze seemed to zero in on Chu Yi as cheers erupted around them. Cries of "Go, Chu Yi! You're the best!" echoed through the air. The enthusiastic support stung Zhou Yi in a way he couldn't fully explain. Doubt crept in, a soft but insistent whisper. Was Xinggu here for Chu Yi too? The thought left Zhou Yi unsettled. If Xinggu wanted Chu Yi to win, he could let it happen. He didn't have to fight. And then it happened, he lost the ball, intercepted by none other than Chu Yi himself. The court erupted in celebration as Chu Yi's team finally tied the score with Zhou Ye's. But before Zhou Yi could let the moment spiral further, Xinggu left the stands. In an instant, she was standing before Zhou Yi, her eyes bright with determination. Come on, Zhou Yi, you've got this. The simplicity of Xing Ji's words, paired with the brilliant sincerity behind them, was enough to cut through the gloom threatening to overtake Zhou Yi. The dull ache in his chest gave way to something warmer, brighter. For Zhou Yi, Xing Ji's encouragement wasn't just words, it was a lifeline, the very thing he needed to keep going. Zhou Yi followed up his bold move with a flawless shot, his hand rising gracefully as the ball soared through the air. It sank through the hoop without hesitation, a perfect three-pointer that turned the game in his favor. The crowd's cheers were deafening, but none were as sweet as Xing Ji's delighted cry, "Amazing, Zhou Yi! That was incredible!" Xinggu even captured the moment on his phone, recording Zhou Yi's brilliant play in stunning detail. Suddenly, the energy shifted again. The same girls who had been swooning over Chu Yi just moments before now looked at Zhou Yi with wide eyes and murmured admiration. Zhou Yi was stealing the spotlight, and it was undeniable, his three-pointer had not just changed the score, but also the crowd's allegiance. In the stands, Xing Ji's deskmate couldn't ignore the growing unease creeping into her thoughts. Was Xinggu genuinely taken with Zhou Yi? Her discomfort prompted her to call out to Xinggu, whose focus remained unwavering as she held up her phone, capturing every second of Zhou Yi's newfound glory. Xinggu couldn't help but muse to herself as she watched the game unfold. Where, she wondered, was the harshness or the edge that Zhou Yi seemed so intent on displaying? Xinggu saw something else entirely, a guy who, beneath his prickly exterior, was insecure and yearning for a sense of safety. Yet, just as her thoughts lingered on Zhou Yi's vulnerabilities, cheers for Chu Yi erupted again from a corner of the court. Zhou Yi's head snapped toward the source of the sound, his glare so sharp it cut through the noise like a knife. The girls who had been cheering for Chu Yi froze, their enthusiasm evaporating under the weight of Zhou Yi's piercing look. Xinggu bit her lip to keep from laughing. Zhou Yi's temper was as quick as it was unapologetic, but Xinggu knew it was only one part of who he was. Because this was the same Zhou Yi who, in another lifetime, had spent 3 years tirelessly caring for her mentally ill grandmother, never once faltering under the crushing weight of responsibility. Shunge couldn't fathom how Zhou Yi had endured it all, but he did, and perhaps that was what made him who he was. It wasn't just skill on the court or his fiery determination. Zhou Yi was more than that, and Shunge knew it better than anyone. The mood on the court shifted dramatically when the opposing team, unwilling to accept defeat, resorted to underhanded tactics. One of their players intentionally body-checked Chen Hao, knocking him off balance as they seized the basketball. Before Chen Hao could hit the ground, Zhou Yi stepped in, swift and steady, catching him just in time. Outrage rippled through Zhou Ye's team. They demanded answers, voices sharp with indignation. "Can't you lose gracefully? Pulling dirty tricks just because you can't win, don't you realize you could have seriously hurt him?" Their accusations hung in the air, but the offending players refused to apologize, dismissing the incident with the claim that Chen Hao had merely tripped on his own. Zhou Ye's eyes narrowed. Without a word, he grabbed the basketball and hurled it toward the boy who had pulled the stunt, the ball connecting with a resounding thud. The boy stumbled back, momentarily stunned as pain lit up his face. Zhou Ye's voice rang out, firm and commanding, demanding an apology for Chen Hao. The intensity of his tone left no room for argument, but Xingge, fearing the situation would escalate into a full-blown fight, rushed to intervene. She positioned herself between the two teams, earning wide-eyed stares from everyone around. Whispers started circulating. Why was she inserting herself into a boys' fight? Was she trying to gain their attention? But Xingge ignored the murmurs. She shielded Zhou Yi, her gaze fierce as she addressed the opposing team. "Your teammate's clearly rattled, you should take him to the infirmary instead of standing around." Turning toward Zhou Yi, Xingge softened her tone, pleading, "Please don't fight. Even if you win, no one can guarantee you won't get hurt." Her words, paired with the unexpected warmth of her hand on Zhou Ye's, sent a ripple of emotion through Zhou Ye's chest.